I think one of the first rules of education, I hope we all agree, is first do no harm. And I'm puzzled at how we're managing to produce so many young boys coming out of education with no sense of themselves, with failure really imprinted on their souls. And this morning, a lot of people were talking about employability. And before employability, I think, comes something else, and that's self-belief. So how is it that we've got an education system that seems to be stripping lots of young men of their self-belief? So I have somebody who I hope is going to explain to you where we might go and why it's very important to have a much more positive story. Here we go. I don't know if many of you know Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was created in 1941 by William Marston. Now, William Marston was very impressed by his wife Elizabeth, because Elizabeth had gone to her father and told her father that she wanted to study law. And her father said, as long as I can keep you in aprons in the kitchen with your mother, the answer is no. So Elizabeth was very resourceful, and she took no as a challenge and went off and got herself 3 degrees. And with these 3 degrees, she met William Marston, and William Marston decided that he wanted to create an ideal woman. So Wonder Woman, as you see, she's got the beauty of Aphrodite, she's got the speed of Mercury, and she has the strength of Hercules, which if you ever lose your keys, you'll know it's very useful to be able to rip off the door. So along with this, what he wanted her to do was be to have a fallback position. So just in case all this power trip didn't work, he also created her to have 160 words a minute of shorthand. So she could always fall back on being a secretary if being a heroine didn't quite work out. And the reason why Marston did this was because he wanted to create a popular psychological model for the new woman of the 1940s. Now, Wonder Woman took off. Women absolutely loved her because she played to their assets, she played to their capabilities, she allowed women to be the rescuer, not the rescued. And that's such a powerful, positive story. We know now, because we know so much more about neuroscience, and we know much more about behavior change, we know positive stories really matter. We're not bubbles that just float around with no connection with each other. We're bubbles that collide and absorb into each other. So what the stories we tell about the kind of people we are is so important. So let's come back to the present time, and let's look around globally. And what sort of story does a young man see, a young teenage male? He looks around him and he sees mostly deficit messages about being a male. I say this as a feminist, and I think it's very important for the future of women and for men that we recognize this and do something about it. We see men as feckless, we see them as absent fathers, we see them as misbehaving, we see them as suffering from whatever conduct disorder may be, we see them constantly vilified. Now, it occurred to me a few years ago that this may not be a problem with being male or even a problem with being masculine. It may be something that our education system is not addressing, that we are rubbing up against the wrong grain when we try and do something about educating our men in a positive way. So it reminds me actually of a story about the young boy who came home from school and said to his father, the father asked him, he said, what did you learn today? And he said, not very much. I have to go back tomorrow and start again. And I think that's the problem with education, that we're not teaching young men and young women for that matter, but young men, the kind of things they need to know. So I'd like to just talk to you about Billy. I met Billy a couple of years ago, and when he was 10, he was expelled from school. He was loud, and he was noisy, and he was funny, and he did what most boys did, but he was expelled from school and sent to his granny. He was in the UK, his granny was in America, and he spent 2 years with his granny, and he told me that his granny had fixed him, and I said, how did she fix you? And he said, she talked to me for a couple of years, and all the time she kept saying to me, why are you so angry? And I would talk to her, and she eventually made me feel better about myself. And I thought, how does a 10-year-old need to feel better about himself? What is it that we're doing? And school obviously isn't 24 hours a day, but what is it we're doing in school that makes a 10-year-old boy feel bad about himself? So I think the the story of Billy, actually, the story of Billy reminds me of something else. A little boy was in school, and his teacher said, "What do you call somebody who's half man, half animal?" And the little boy thought for a while, and then he said, "Buffalo Bill." So it shows you how inventive children can be. So to get back to Billy, what we're told with boys is that if there were more men in the classroom, that would help, more male teachers. But in fact, we know from research that a lot of male teachers actually become even more macho because they're in a very female environment, which is largely dominated by women, or they see it that's dominated by women. So they can be even more macho and sometimes be highly sexist to girls. So it's not just getting more men into classrooms, it's actually the kind of man that you get into classrooms. And we know that learners, teachers need to be learners too, as we've been hearing this morning. And a lot of teachers, even in Sweden they've been doing a lot of work on gender, and they decided to film teachers in their classroom. And these are teachers who believe they've stripped themselves of all prejudice. And of course, what we saw often in many ways was the sort of stereotypes that when it came to playtime, for example, the girls were praised for being nice and quiet in their seats, and the boys were told to go off and rough and tumble. So even the messages we convey are really are very, very important in terms of the stories that young boys and young girls pick up and absorb within themselves. Now, we've had 30 and 40 years of addressing these issues, particularly when it comes to women. So gender now has become associated almost entirely with women, but it's very, very important that it's associated with boys as well. And I'll tell you why I think so in particular. As a feminist, I care very much about issues like domestic violence, sexualization of society, equality. But I know that they affect men and boys as adversely as they affect many women. We know from research that boys can be as diverse within themselves and have as many differences within groups of boys as there are between boys and girls. And yet that diversity within being a boy in today's society somehow is rendered invisible. And I think we need to bring that back into focus. The reason why I think it's particularly important now, and it's always been important, but the reason why I think it's particularly important that we start to give more positive stories, to work more with the grain of young men in education, is that women are advancing very fast. Wherever you go, women are advancing very fast. And one of the things that's emerging is this thing called coercive control. Coercive control isn't the traditional form of domestic violence, which is a very domineering man and a woman with very few rights. Coercive control is about when you see your female partner traveling at a rate of knots and really taking over and moving far away from you, and you're still in this entrenched stereotypical male position, and your female partner is so far ahead, the only thing you can do is try and control her by intimidation, by stalking, and the physical violence and the sexual violence is only the very end of the process. And I think if we're not careful, if we don't start being more positive about boys, you will see females moving ahead like a rate of knots, and a new battle between the sexes starting. So it's very, very important. The other obvious reason is because we need young men to come out of schools and universities and colleges with the feeling that what they do matters, that they're not failures before they start, that things like, which we all talk about, like self-discipline, like delayed gratification, like persistence, like, what else do we talk about? We talk about the ability to think ahead, the ability to bounce back. All of these things are not just the remit of females. They can be male qualities as well. We need more women in engineering, we need more men in caring, but somehow we have to stop treating the whole exercise as gender neutral. It isn't gender neutral. There's not much more I'd like to say really, except that I know that we need to start looking. I went to a school in Lincoln recently. It was a primary school, and it had been failing for years in a very deprived area. And 3 years ago, a young headmaster took over, and he was very, very determined that he would bring into this school all of the kind of techniques that we've been talking about at WISE, and we will be talking about at WISE. So when I went to visit the school, it was transformed. He said that when he'd first got there, he'd asked two 10-year-old boys that were fighting in the playground. He asked one of the boys, "What would you like to do when you grow up? And this 10-year-old boy said, I'd like to go to prison like my dad. And Carl, and this is the head teacher, Carl was so shocked and appalled by that. That's what really triggered the revolution and speeded it up, that he's achieved in his classroom. So in his classroom, there are no desks, there are no chairs. Every classroom is a setting for a new production that happens every day. They work in small teams, they work collaboratively, they have iPads, they work with the teacher works with, not doing to, it's not didactic, it's wonderful. What I wonder about is how much do we know about all of these things that we're talking about today and in the next 2 days? How much do we know about the impact they make on boys and girls, and which boys and girls? Are we really aware of the gender impact of the kinds of new tools that we're talking about? Because instinctively, I think they probably go with the grain of what it means to be a woman, a conditioned woman, but I think probably it goes more with the grain of being a woman than it does with being a man, and somehow we need to address that. So, I have no solutions, I'm just raising questions, I'm asking for contributions from the floor because I don't know what the answers are. It might be that what we need is a wonder man. Maybe we need a new psychological portrait of what it means to be a man in the 21st century, because at present we don't have them. What we have is Superman, who spends a lot of time in the phone box with his underpants on, and he's not very collaborative, and he needs quite a lot of work because all he seems to do is zip about and not be very reflective. So if anybody has any suggestions about Wonder Man, I'd be very pleased to hear it, and thank you.